For the first few years, life in my suburban neighborhood was as peaceful as I'd imagined when I first moved in. Just the right mix of quiet streets, well-kept lawns, and friendly but not intrusive neighbors. It was the kind of place where the most heated disputes were over who got to host the annual block party or whether the Halloween decorations were getting too extravagant. The homeowners association existed, of course, but it functioned more like an advisory group than an iron-fisted regime, mostly keeping track of small maintenance issues and sending the occasional reminder about keeping trash bins out of sight. Nobody really had problems with the HOA back then. They weren't the most approachable people, but they also weren't actively making life difficult for anyone. But all of that changed the moment Maria took over. If the previous HOA board had been a group of well-meaning but mildly disorganized volunteers, Maria's leadership was a military coup in comparison. The moment she was voted in as president, everything took on an entirely new tone, one that was more about control than actual community improvement. At first, it was subtle little changes that seemed harmless, even helpful, like an increase in weekly inspections or reminders about keeping up the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. But it didn't take long for things to escalate. Within a few months, violations were being issued for trivial infractions. A trash bin that was left out 30 minutes past collection time, a mailbox that wasn't the exact shade of beige approved by the HOA, a basketball hoop that was too visible from the street. Suddenly, fines started appearing in people's mailboxes, and with them came an unspoken pressure to comply or risk facing consequences that nobody quite understood yet. I tried to stay under the radar, keeping my lawn neat, ensuring my Christmas lights were down the day after New Year's, and generally avoiding any reason to attract Maria's attention. But my house had one particular feature that was apparently unacceptable in Maria's new HOA dictatorship: my driveway. You see, my home sat at a small bend in the road, right before an entrance to a busier street. Because of this, for as long as I'd lived there, people had used my driveway as a convenient turnaround spot. Delivery drivers, lost visitors, even random strangers looking for a place to briefly park while making a phone call. At least 3 or 4 times a day, a car would swing into my driveway, sometimes with screeching tires, and then back out as if my property was a public rest stop. The problem wasn't just that it was annoying, though it absolutely was, but also that it was causing actual damage. I'd find fresh tire marks on my pavement every week, little oil stains from leaking engines, and even, on one especially frustrating occasion, an empty fast food bag left right on my driveway as if my house was a roadside trash bin. And that wasn't even the worst of it. Twice, my car had almost been hit by people recklessly reversing out of my property. I even had a scare where a distracted driver nearly ran over my mailbox in their hurry to back out onto the road. It wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It was a liability. So, after dealing with it for far too long, I finally decided to take action. I spent weeks researching my options. I wasn't about to make any modifications that could put me at odds with HOA rules or city ordinances, so I made sure to go through every single regulation that could apply. I scoured the HOA's handbook, cross-referenced it with city permits, and even called the county office to double-check whether I needed any special approvals. Once I was absolutely sure that I was in the clear, I hired a licensed contractor and arranged for the installation of a simple, elegant black metal gate. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a sliding gate that matched the overall look of my neighborhood and could be kept closed during peak traffic hours. Nothing about it violated the existing guidelines. If anything, it actually improved the look of my driveway, tying in with my house's modern accents. The installation took a full Saturday, with the workers carefully measuring and aligning the gate to ensure it functioned smoothly. When it was finally complete, I stood back and admired it with a sense of relief. No more random cars pulling in at all hours. No more oil stains. No more close calls. Problem solved, or so I thought. The trouble started the very next morning. I had barely stepped outside with my coffee when I spotted Maria across the street, standing on the sidewalk with her phone in hand, snapping picture after picture of my driveway. She wasn't trying to be discreet about it, either. She angled her phone like a crime scene investigator gathering damning evidence, zooming in, stepping back, tilting the camera to capture different angles. It was bizarre. For a moment, I considered walking over and asking if there was some kind of issue, but something about the way she glared at my property made me pause. Instead, I raised a hand in an awkward half-wave. "Morning, Maria. Everything okay?" She didn't respond, not verbally anyway. Instead, she lowered her phone, gave me a tight, disapproving glare, and then turned on her heel, marching off like she had just confirmed the neighborhood's worst scandal. I watched her leave, a nagging sense of unease creeping up my spine. The next day, my unease turned into full-blown frustration when I found an official HOA violation notice pinned to my mailbox. The bright yellow paper was impossible to miss, stamped with the bold letters. "Unauthorized modification, immediate removal required." My stomach twisted as I skimmed the notice. According to the document, my gate was in violation of the community's architectural uniformity standards, and I had exactly 48 hours to remove it or face fines starting at $500 per day. I stood there, gripping the paper so tightly that it crumpled slightly in my hands. This made no sense. I had followed every rule to the letter. The HOA handbook explicitly allowed automatic gates as long as they were within the color palette and under 6 feet in height. Mine was well within both requirements. And yet, here I was, being targeted with what was essentially a threat disguised as official policy. I took a deep breath, telling myself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe this was a simple mistake, an outdated policy that hadn't been updated online. Maybe Maria had simply assumed my gate was against the rules without actually checking. Either way, I decided to handle this the way any reasonable homeowner would. I'd go to Maria, armed with my paperwork, and clarify the situation. I spent that evening preparing. I printed out copies of the HOA guidelines, highlighting the section that explicitly permitted gates like mine. I gathered my city permits, my contractor's receipts, and even photos showing how the gate blended seamlessly with the neighborhood's aesthetic. Wanting to soften the conversation, I even baked a batch of my mother's famous chocolate chip cookies. It was a trick she always swore by. People are less likely to be unreasonable when they're eating something sweet. So, the next morning, I walked over to Maria's house with my documents in one hand and a neatly packed container of cookies in the other. As I approached her front door, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A security camera, perched above her porch, its lens tracking my every movement. I had barely lifted my hand to knock when a crackling voice came through a small speaker. "I see you, and I'm documenting everything." Maria's voice was cold and clipped, laced with an edge of superiority. I blinked, caught off guard. "Maria, I just wanted to talk about." She cut me off. "There's nothing to talk about. That gate lowers our property values. It needs to be removed. The board is already aware, and we'll be discussing your violation at an emergency meeting tomorrow. I suggest you prepare to comply." And with that, the speaker went silent. I stood there for a few moments, dumbfounded. I had come expecting a conversation. Instead, I got a declaration of war. I returned home with the violation notice still clenched in my fist, my mind racing through 1,000 different thoughts, each one angrier than the last. This wasn't some simple mix-up. Maria had gone out of her way to target me. But why? Was it just because she needed an easy victim to assert her power? Did she have some personal grudge I wasn't aware of? Or was this just her latest attempt at turning the HOA into her own personal empire? Regardless of the reason, one thing was clear. She wasn't going to back down. That much was obvious from the way she had spoken through her security camera, like she was some kind of tyrant surveying her domain. But if she thought I was just going to roll over and take this, she had another thing coming. I spent the rest of the evening meticulously preparing for the so-called emergency meeting. I printed out multiple copies of the HOA's own rulebook, highlighting every section that backed me up. I gathered the city's zoning laws, contractor receipts, permits, anything and everything that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that my gate was entirely legal. By the time I was finished, I had an entire folder's worth of evidence, a fortress of paperwork that even the most corrupt HOA president would struggle to tear down. But as I sat there, staring at the neatly arranged documents, a nagging thought wormed its way into my mind. Would proof even matter to someone like Maria? The next morning, I arrived at the meeting 15 minutes early, my folder tucked under my arm. The HOA held its gatherings in the community clubhouse, a small but pristine building near the neighborhood entrance, typically used for baby showers and book clubs. But today, the atmosphere was far from friendly. As I stepped inside, I immediately noticed the tension in the air. The usual casual chatter was missing. Instead, a hush had settled over the room, an unspoken sense of unease that rippled through the gathered homeowners. Some of them glanced at me as I entered, quickly looking away when I met their eyes. Others whispered to each other, their expressions a mix of curiosity and wariness. It didn't take long to figure out why. The front of the room had been transformed into something that looked less like a meeting space and more like a corporate boardroom. A projector had been set up, its screen displaying a PowerPoint presentation ominously titled, "The Decline of Community Standards." Maria stood next to it, her arms crossed, flanked by two board members who looked more like her personal enforcers than actual volunteers. And then there was the most telling sign of all, the stack of freshly printed violation notices sitting on a nearby table, each one stamped with bold red letters. The meeting started promptly at 9 a.m., with Maria wasting no time launching into her speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering bad news at a press conference. "We have a crisis on our hands." She clicked a button, and the first slide changed, showing a picture of a rundown neighborhood. Overgrown lawns, broken fences, graffiti-stained walls. "This is what happens when we fail to uphold our community standards," she continued. "It starts with one small violation, and before you know it, everything falls apart." Another click. This time, the image changed to a well-manicured neighborhood with neatly trimmed hedges and uniform mailboxes. "But when we work together," she said dramatically, "we can preserve the beauty and value of our homes." I barely held back a scoff. This was a joke, a propaganda campaign disguised as a community meeting. And the worst part? Some people in the audience were actually nodding along, buying into her nonsense. Then, with a theatrical sigh, Maria clicked to the next slide, "My driveway." Or at least what was supposed to be my driveway. But the image had been altered. Instead of the simple, modern gate I had installed, the picture showed a massive, industrial-looking structure, complete with rusted metal bars and barbed wire fencing. Gasps rippled through the room. "This," Maria declared, pointing to the exaggerated image, "is what we're dealing with. A blatant disregard for our community guidelines. A structure that, quite frankly, makes this neighborhood look like a prison yard." That was it. I stood up. "That's not my gate," I said firmly. All eyes turned to me. "This image has been altered to make it look far worse than it actually is. My gate is well within regulations, both HOA and city code. I have the documents to prove it." Maria's eyes narrowed. "Then why," she asked smoothly, "did you not seek prior approval?" "Because approval wasn't necessary," I shot back. "The HOA handbook specifically states that gates matching community aesthetics and staying under 6 feet in height are allowed. Mine checks all those boxes." I opened my folder, flipping through the highlighted pages and passing them around. Some neighbors leaned forward, reading carefully, murmuring to one another. A few nodded in agreement, realizing I was right. Maria, however, remained unfazed. "Regardless," she said coolly, clicking to the next slide. A bar graph with no sources cited, just a series of random percentages. "Property values have already started declining due to unapproved modifications like this one. We cannot allow this precedent." "That's not real data," I countered. "Where are these numbers from? Where's the source?" She ignored me. "The board has voted," she announced, folding her arms. "And we have determined that this structure must be removed. Effective immediately, you will be fined $1,500 per day until compliance is met." A stunned silence followed. Even some of the more passive homeowners looked taken aback. "You can't do that," I said, my voice low but firm. "Yes, we can," Maria replied, smiling for the first time. "It's in our authority." I stared at her, feeling something beyond frustration settle in my chest. This wasn't about rules. This was personal. She was testing me, seeing if she could push me into submission like she had done with others. And that's when I knew this wasn't going to end with a simple fine. She wasn't going to stop until I was humiliated, forced to comply like everyone else. I clenched my jaw. "I'm not removing my gate," I said, my voice steady, "and I won't be paying a cent in fines. If you want to take this further, be my guest." Maria's smile faltered, her fingers tightening around the remote in her hand. "Then prepare for the consequences," she said quietly. The meeting ended in a flurry of whispered conversations and uneasy glances. Some neighbors approached me, shaking their heads. "This is ridiculous," one muttered. "She's been pushing too far for a while now." "You're right to stand your ground," another added, but others kept their distance, afraid to be seen aligning with me. I understood. Maria had instilled fear, made it clear that dissent would be punished. I left the clubhouse feeling more determined than ever. This wasn't just about a gate anymore. This was about standing up to a bully in a position of power. And if Maria wanted a fight, she was going to get one. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was just how far she was willing to go. Because that night, under the cover of darkness, she would make her next move. And this time, she wasn't coming alone. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Even after the HOA meeting had ended and I had returned home, my mind refused to settle. I sat on my couch, scrolling through the messages I had received from neighbors. Some supportive, some wary, others completely silent. The ones who had dared to agree with me at the meeting had sent cautious encouragement, but their words carried an underlying fear. "Watch your back, man. Maria's not going to let this go. She's done worse to others. Just be careful." I didn't doubt it. I had seen how she operated, how she had slowly tightened her grip on the neighborhood under the guise of upholding standards. The problem was, I still didn't know how she planned to escalate. But I had a feeling I was about to find out. It was a little past midnight when my phone buzzed, a motion alert from my security cameras. I frowned, rubbing the exhaustion from my eyes as I opened the app. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. The camera feed showed my driveway, quiet and empty except for the dim glow of the streetlight. Then movement. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, their outlines barely visible as they crept across my lawn. My pulse jumped. They weren't just passing by. They were here for something. I switched to another camera angle, my stomach tightening as I got a clearer view. Maria was standing at the edge of my driveway, flanked by 2 HOA board members. One of them held a clipboard, the other a flashlight, which he was using to methodically scan my property. They weren't just inspecting my house, they were documenting something. I turned up the audio, my heartbeat loud in my ears as I listened in. Measuring the setback distance, one of the men murmured, crouching near my gate with a tape measure. Maria stood with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Make sure you get the exact footage. We need it for the complaint report." "Are we sure about this?" the other board member asked, shifting uncomfortably. "He has all the right permits. This could backfire." Maria scoffed. "It won't. No one's going to question us. They trust the HOA to enforce the rules." I gritted my teeth. This wasn't about my gate anymore. This was about power. She wanted to manufacture a reason to escalate things, to make it look like I had done something wrong, even though I hadn't. Then, something unexpected happened. A 4th figure stepped into view, a man I had never seen before. He was dressed in all black, his posture rigid and authoritative. He didn't look like a board member or even a regular neighborhood resident. He had the kind of presence that demanded attention. And then I saw what was in his hand. A sleek black business card with silver lettering. He handed it to Maria, speaking low enough that I had to crank up the audio to catch his words. "You'll have your enforcement team by the end of the week," he said smoothly. "They specialize in compliance measures." Maria took the card, nodding approvingly. "Good. And they'll be discreet." Of course, the man's lips curled into a smirk. "They're professionals." The camera couldn't make out the text on the card clearly, but I didn't need to see the name to know that this was bad news. HOA boards didn't have enforcement teams. They didn't have private security firms working on their behalf. This wasn't about issuing fines or following guidelines anymore. Maria was taking this somewhere dangerous. I sat there, gripping my phone, watching as they continued to take their measurements, snap their photos, and document their fabricated violations. Then, after what felt like an eternity, they left. But I knew this wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The next morning, I did some digging. I started with a basic search of the phrase HOA Enforcement Services, trying to see if any legitimate companies matched what I had seen. The results were limited. Most security companies that worked with neighborhoods were either private patrol services or contractors who specialized in basic property protection. But there was no record of any company specializing in HOA enforcement, at least not in any legal capacity. Then, I searched for a phrase that had stuck in my mind from the meeting: West Valley Security Services. It had been mentioned briefly when Maria had announced that they had contracted a firm to deal with my gate. The results were even more concerning. No website, no official business registry, no listed office address. Just a handful of vague references on forum discussions, most of which were horror stories from people in other communities who had dealt with them before. They showed up in black SUVs and pretended to be cops. They tried to intimidate homeowners into paying fines on the spot. They brought dogs to someone's house in the middle of the night. A chill ran down my spine. Maria hadn't hired a security firm. She had hired a scam operation, a group of people who pretended to be law enforcement, relying on intimidation and fear to force compliance. And worst of all, she thought she could get away with it. I immediately saved every forum thread I found, every reference to their name, every piece of information I could gather. If Maria was going to try something, I needed proof that this company wasn't legitimate. But as I was compiling my research, another email notification popped up on my phone. It was from Maria. Subject: Final notice, compliance enforcement in progress. I opened it, my stomach twisting. Due to your continued refusal to comply with community standards, the HOA has been forced to escalate enforcement efforts. Expect a compliance visit within 24 hours. Failure to cooperate will result in additional fines and necessary intervention. I stared at the words. Necessary intervention. She wasn't even hiding her intentions anymore. Maria was planning something big. And whatever it was happening tomorrow. I quickly forwarded the email to myself, making sure I had a copy stored outside my primary account, then called the city's housing department to file a formal inquiry. If she was about to pull something drastic, I wanted the authorities to already have a record of her behavior. Then, as a final step, I picked up my phone and called my father. "Dad," I said, my voice tight with tension, "I need to tell you what's going on." I had been trying to handle this myself, trying to prove that I could stand up to Maria without needing backup. But after what I had just uncovered, I wasn't taking any chances, because tomorrow Maria wasn't just sending a fine. She was sending the HOA police. The next morning, I woke up with a knot of unease twisting in my gut. I didn't have to wonder why. I knew something was coming. Maria had made it clear in her email that compliance enforcement was imminent, and from everything I had read about West Valley Security Services, I wasn't dealing with some run-of-the-mill HOA fine collector. This was going to be ugly. Still, nothing could have prepared me for what actually happened. At exactly 7 a.m., my security system pinged me with multiple motion alerts. I groggily reached for my phone, expecting maybe a stray raccoon or an early morning jogger. But the moment I saw the camera feed, I bolted upright in bed, adrenaline blasting through me like an electric shock. 3 black SUVs were parked outside my house. Each one had HOA enforcement plastered across the side in bold white lettering. There were no official city or county insignias, just those vague, intimidating words designed to make them look like an official force. My breath caught as I took in the rest of the scene. 6 men in black cargo pants and tactical boots were moving across my front yard like they were gearing up for a drug raid. They weren't wearing standard security uniforms. Instead, they had black shirts with security printed on them, fake-looking badges pinned to their chests, and radios clipped to their belts. And then there was the worst part, the dog. A massive German shepherd, straining against its leash, barking aggressively at my front door. Maria was there too, of course. Unlike the so-called security team, she wasn't dressed for combat. She had on one of her usual pristine workout outfits, standing off to the side with her arms folded, a smug look plastered across her face. She was filming everything on her phone like this was some kind of TV spectacle. Then, one of the men stepped onto my porch and pounded on my door with the side of his fist, hard enough to rattle the frame. "Open up. This is your final warning." I stared at my screen, my heart slamming against my ribs. Final warning? Final warning for what? Through my security camera speaker, I spoke. "Who are you people, and what do you want?" The lead guy, big, bald, and built like a nightclub bouncer, glanced at Maria before turning back to the camera. "We're with HOA Enforcement," he barked. "You're in violation of community standards. If you don't remove the unauthorized structure immediately, we will." I gritted my teeth. "You are not with any official enforcement agency. You're trespassing on private property. I suggest you leave." That only seemed to rile them up more. The dog handler gave the leash a sharp tug, stepping up onto my porch as if preparing for something worse. "You've had ample warnings," Maria chimed in, stepping forward. "This is the final step. We have every right to ensure compliance." My hands tightened around my phone. This was insane. They were treating this like a full-scale police operation over a damn driveway gate. But I knew what they were trying to do. They wanted to intimidate me into backing down, into letting them take control of my property and voluntarily removing the gate. That wasn't happening. I exhaled slowly, then called my father. "Dad," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm, "I need you to get here. Now." Something in my tone must have told him everything he needed to know because his response was immediate. "What's going on?" I quickly explained the situation, the fake security team, the SUVs, the damn K9 unit that was barking on my porch. There was a slight pause on the other end of the line. Then, my dad's voice came back, sharp and commanding. "Lock your doors. Stay inside. Do not engage them. I'm on my way." I hung up and turned my attention back to the security feed. The fake officers were still moving around, now inspecting my gate like they were about to tear it down right then and there. Maria smirked, gesturing to the lead guy. "Get the tools," she ordered. One of the men nodded, heading toward the SUV. A few seconds later, he emerged holding a bolt cutter. "Oh hell no." I turned the camera mic back on. "If any of you so much as touch that gate, I will have you arrested for destruction of private property." That made them hesitate for a second. But Maria, ever the power-hungry tyrant, wasn't backing down. "You've had your chance," she snapped. "You brought this on yourself." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. They were escalating on purpose, hoping I would panic and do something reckless. Instead, I simply repeated, "I've called the police." That changed the energy. One of the fake officers stiffened. The man holding the bolt cutter lowered it slightly, his fingers tightening around the handle. But Maria? She actually laughed. "The police," she said mockingly. "Oh please, this is an HOA matter. You think they're going to get involved over this?" I didn't answer, because at that exact moment, sirens echoed from the far end of the street. The expressions on the so-called security team's faces changed instantly. The bravado disappeared. The confidence drained. One of them actually muttered, "Oh shit." Seconds later, 2 patrol cars screeched to a stop behind the black SUVs. The doors flung open, and out stepped my father, Chief Gary Williams. Maria's face drained of color. My dad surveyed the scene with the cold, unreadable expression he had perfected over decades in law enforcement. He took in the fake badges, the black SUVs, the barking K9, and, most importantly, the group of uniformed men impersonating an actual security task force. "Everyone drop what you're holding and step back," he ordered, his voice commanding. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Officer Kenneth, one of my dad's men, spoke up. "You heard the chief. Hands where we can see them." One by one, the fake officers complied, stepping away from my porch with varying degrees of nervousness. The man holding the bolt cutter actually tossed it onto the ground, as if trying to distance himself from it entirely. My father turned to Maria, his gaze sharp as a blade. "Would you like to explain what's happening here?" Maria floundered, her usual smugness completely gone. "We were just ensuring compliance," she stammered. This homeowner is in violation of HOA regulations, and we were authorized to enforce community standards. You hired an unlicensed security team to raid someone's home over a driveway gate. My father cut in coldly. Do you realize how many laws that violates? Maria opened her mouth, then closed it again. One of the fake security guys tried to step in. We're just following orders, he said. My dad's head snapped toward him. You're impersonating security officers without a license. That's a felony in this state. So unless you want to be following orders straight into a holding cell, I suggest you stay silent. Silence. Then, Officer Kenneth and Officer Paul stepped forward, producing handcuffs. Maria took a shaky step back. Wait, you're all coming with us, my dad announced, starting with the one in charge. And just like that, Maria's reign was over. Maria was still frozen in place, her entire face drained of color, as my father and his officers moved in. The so-called security enforcers were already putting their hands up. Their bravado completely shattered the moment real law enforcement had arrived. The man who had been holding the bolt cutter was the first to speak, his voice laced with barely contained panic. Look, we were just hired for a job, he stammered, his hands raised in surrender. We didn't know anything illegal was happening. My dad wasn't buying it. Really? You didn't know that impersonating security personnel, trespassing, making unlawful threats, and attempting to destroy private property were crimes? The guy swallowed hard but didn't say anything else. Meanwhile, Maria was still trying to process what was happening. She had gone from absolute queen of the HOA to a suspect in the span of mere minutes. You can't, she started, her voice shaky. This is an HOA matter. You have no jurisdiction over our enforcement procedures. My father turned his head slowly, the kind of measured look that meant he had just heard the dumbest thing imaginable. Jurisdiction? He repeated, his voice edged with disbelief. Maria, did you honestly think you had the legal authority to conduct a militarized raid over a driveway gate? Maria's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, only for her to say nothing. One of the other HOA board members, the one who had been with Maria when she was snooping around my property the night before, suddenly turned on her. I told you this was going too far, he snapped, stepping away from her as if he didn't want to be caught in the blast radius of her downfall. You said this was all handled legally. You said we had authorization to do this. Maria spun on him, her previous panic twisting into rage. Oh, don't you dare act like you weren't in on this, she hissed. You signed off on the enforcement order just like everyone else. But you hired fake cops, Maria. Another board member interjected, his voice thick with barely controlled anger. You lied about this being official. None of us agreed to send in a damn K-9 unit to someone's house. And just like that, the entire board turned on her. It was like watching a ship sink in real time. Maria was grasping for control, grasping for some way to twist the situation back in her favor. But there was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. And then my dad dropped the hammer. We've already started checking into this so-called security company, he said, crossing his arms. And guess what we found? Silence. Nothing. No valid business license. No certification. No legal standing whatsoever. Maria visibly wilted. And you, Maria, paid them out of HOA funds, my dad continued, his voice heavy with authority. Which means you might have some financial crimes to answer for, too. The moment the words financial crimes left his mouth, Maria's whole demeanor collapsed. Because that was the real endgame here. Threatening me over a gate was one thing. Hiring fake enforcers was another. But embezzling HOA funds? That was prison time. Maria started shaking her head rapidly, her lips moving like she was trying to form an argument, but nothing came out. It was as if her brain was short-circuiting from the sheer magnitude of her mistake. Meanwhile, the HOA enforcement team, or rather, the unlicensed scammers Maria had hired, were all being put in handcuffs. Wait, 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 one of them said, his voice pitching up in desperation. We're just contractors. We were just doing a job. We didn't mean. You impersonated law enforcement to intimidate a homeowner into compliance. My dad shot back, not even looking at him as he spoke. That's multiple felonies right there. You want to keep talking? Or do you want to wait for your lawyer? The guy's mouth snapped shut. And then, for the first time ever, Maria stayed silent, too. Because she knew. She knew she had lost. A few of my neighbors had gathered outside, whispering among themselves as they watched the entire phony security force get arrested right there in front of my house. Maria stood in place, trembling, as she watched everything unravel around her. She looked at me, and I looked right back. She had spent months trying to break me, trying to bully me into submission, trying to make an example out of me so that no one else in the neighborhood would ever challenge her again. And now, she was the one being escorted off my property in disgrace. Maria Robinson, my father finally said, his voice steady and official. You're under investigation for misappropriation of HOA funds, unauthorized use of enforcement personnel, and unlawful harassment of a private citizen. A shocked murmur rippled through the onlookers. Maria stared at him, her eyes wide and disbelieving, like she couldn't process that this was actually happening. But it was. And this was only the beginning, because after today, the entire HOA was about to burn. And Maria was going down with it. Maria sat stiffly on the curb in front of my house, her expensive workout outfit now coated with dust from the sidewalk. The officers had placed her in handcuffs while they finalized paperwork, and despite all the boldness she had shown earlier, she now looked utterly broken. The neighbors who had gathered were whispering furiously, some with their phones out recording. She had spent months trying to intimidate people into silence, but now she was the spectacle. The fake security force was already being loaded into police vehicles, their false badges confiscated, their cheap black uniforms now a laughable reminder of their wannabe cop delusion. I watched as one of them, a younger guy who had clearly been in over his head, kept shaking his head like he still couldn't believe what was happening. But Maria, she had gone eerily silent. Not the furious, spitting kind of silent. No, this was the kind of silence that came from someone calculating. Someone who knew that her world was imploding and was desperately searching for an escape. Too bad for her, there wasn't one, because the damage was already done. And soon, everyone would know just how deep her corruption ran. The moment Maria was taken into custody, the rest of the HOA scrambled. An emergency meeting was called that very evening, one that, this time, I actually wanted to attend. I wasn't the only one. The room was packed with homeowners, some of whom had never bothered to show up to a single meeting before. But today, everyone wanted answers. Maria wasn't there, obviously. She was too busy dealing with actual law enforcement. But the rest of the board was, and they looked terrified. The HOA treasurer, an older woman named Joyce, stood up, cleared her throat and said, "We have a situation." A bitter laugh rippled through the room. Yeah, no kidding. And then the floodgates opened. What the hell was Maria thinking? Hiring a fake police force? Did you guys even vote on this? Or did she just do it herself? Where did she even get the money for that? That's not in our budget. At that last question, the treasurer visibly paled. And that's when I knew they had found something worse. The treasurer adjusted her glasses, swallowed hard, and said, "We've started reviewing the HOA's financial records, and we have some concerns." The room went still. "What kind of concerns?" someone finally asked. Joyce hesitated. Then, with an almost apologetic tone, she said, "There are thousands of dollars missing." A collective gasp filled the room. "We don't have all the details yet," Joyce continued quickly, "but we've already found multiple unauthorized expenses that Maria pushed through without board approval. Not just for this enforcement team, but for a lot of things." "What kind of things?" someone demanded. Joyce exhaled. "Personal expenses. Unauthorized community improvement projects that were never voted on. Payments to companies that don't exist. It's bad. It was worse than bad. It was fraud." Maria had been stealing from the HOA for months, maybe even longer, and the moment that fact sunk in, the entire room turned on her. It didn't take long for the board to take action. A formal vote was held that very night, and with an almost violent level of enthusiasm, Maria was removed from her position as HOA president. Not temporarily suspended, not put under review. Gone. for good. The HOA board announced that they would be working with law enforcement to determine the full extent of Maria's financial crimes. A forensic accountant was brought in to audit every expense Maria had ever authorized. And the deeper they dug, the worse it got. By the time they were finished, Maria was officially facing charges for embezzlement, fraud, and harassment. Her entire career in HOA leadership was finished. And as for the money she stole, the city froze her assets to ensure that every cent was repaid. But the biggest humiliation? She couldn't stay in the neighborhood, because after all of this, her house, it was foreclosed. A few weeks later, a for sale sign was planted on Maria's perfectly manicured front lawn. There was no farewell party, no dramatic exit. One day she was there. The next, she was gone. And nobody missed her. Neighbors celebrated the fact that they could finally breathe without fear of random fines. People started fixing up their homes the way they wanted, planting flowers Maria would have freaked out over, repainting their doors in colors she had deemed unacceptable. And my gate, the one she had declared a crime against humanity, stayed. Not only did it stay, it started a trend. More and more homeowners started installing their own driveway gates, realizing that they actually liked the way it looked. The very thing Maria had claimed was ruining the community ended up becoming a new neighborhood feature. Irony at its finest. A new HOA is formed. With Maria out of the picture, the HOA underwent a massive restructuring. New board members were elected, people who actually cared about the community, not just their own power. New rules were put in place to prevent anything like this from happening again. No single person could ever have as much power as Maria did. Every major decision had to be voted on by the entire community, not just a few board members. Fines had to be fair and justified with actual evidence. Slowly but surely, the dictatorship Maria built was torn down. And the neighborhood? It was better off without her. Maria thought she was untouchable. She thought she could bully people into compliance, use fear and intimidation to control an entire community. She thought she was above the law. But in the end, she found out the hard way that no amount of fake authority can protect you when you're actually breaking the law. And the best part? She lost everything because she picked a fight over something as stupid as a driveway gate. You can't make this stuff up. And that, folks, is the story of how an HOA president sent a fake K-9 unit to raid my property and ended up losing everything. I fought back. I stood my ground. And now, my neighborhood is finally free.